The Flint Water crisis, debate on guns and presidential power, and DPS running out of cash. Happy New Year. MiWeek is back, and it starts right now.
Did you know Michigan's foundation was created by pioneers with big ideas, like Delta Airlines, starting as a crop dusting operation more than 90 years ago. Delta has been flying passengers for more than 86 years. Today, the global airline serves more than 300 destinations on 6 continents and more than 170 million customers each year. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out as small companies with big ideas. We are the business leaders for Michigan.
Welcome back, MiWeek friends. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm Christy McDonald. It is our first show of the new year, and we are already on news overload this week. A state of emergency in the Flint Water crisis, the raging gun control regulations debate, and Detroit schools out of cash in about 3 months. Is that enough for you? Well, we're going to start off with the latest in the Flint water crisis. Here is what you need to know. The governor signed an emergency declaration this week after the county and the city of Flint asked for it. This would put Flint in line for state money to keep addressing what is being called an ongoing health and safety crisis. And this all comes just over a week after the governor apologized to the people of Flint and head of the Department of Environmental Quality resigned. Now, the U.S. Attorney's Office out of Detroit confirms they are working with the EPA on some kind of investigation into what's happening. So is the emergency declaration enough for Flint? Should there be more investigations or hearings at the federal level? And with the recent resignations and an I'm sorry, has the governor done enough? There is a lot to talk about. So let's bring in Nolan Finley. He's the editorial page editor of the Detroit News. Stephen Henderson, the editorial page editor of the Detroit Free Press. Happy New Year, guys.
Yeah.
It's good to see you.
Good to see you.
And enough to talk about this week. It was hard to decide what the lead was going to be, but I think you have to go into Flint. And what I find fascinating about this situation and the ongoing crisis is that I feel that there's been a lot of peaks and valleys, and it finally reached a crescendo in October when the state finally intervened, switched the water system back, and said we have a problem here, acknowledged that there was a problem, and then it got quiet for a little while, and then the national media picked up on it, which I thought was interesting that it took them so long. And then you had the governor come out right after Christmas apologizing. You had his task force come back with some news, and you had the head of the DEQ resign. So Nolan, what do you make of where we are right now with the state of emergency being called?
Well, as George W. Bush learned in Louisiana after Katrina, it's hard to recover from a late start. And the governor got a late start in publicly responding to this and presenting himself as very concerned, very urgent in this matter. And I think it's going to take a lot of catch-up now on his part to establish himself as a guy who is in control of this situation and who takes this situation seriously. I believe he does, but I think the fact that he sort of relied on his MDEQ department for so long and apparently got such bad information from him is really going to hurt.
Do you think that he made the right moves when he needed to make them?
Not when he needed to make them. I mean, it's all very late. It's all extremely late. I mean, when you go back through the emails and the records and you see at what point the Department of Environmental Quality understood that the chemical that needed to be added to the water to stop it from stripping the lead from the pipes hadn't been in there. That's a long time ago, and they spent a long time denying that they knew or denying that this was taking place. So it all comes extremely late, and what I have a hard time with is coming up with what the consequences should be as a result of this. I mean, on the one hand, you have this human rights crisis in Flint now. All of these children in particular who have been poisoned by the water, and there's all kinds of stuff that needs to be done to deal with that. On the other hand, there's got to be some sort of consequences, I feel like, for the people who did not do their jobs or who willfully ignored the information to let this happen and go on for as long as.
Do you think there should be some kind of criminal charges?
Well, I don't know, but I do think you need to demonstrate that you're going to institute a culture change in the MDEQ. I mean, there were some serious mistakes made there, serious neglect, oversights, what have you. But it becomes very apparent that they were doing everything they could to dismiss the seriousness of this issue. That doesn't start with the director. I mean, Dan Wyatt, I mean, I'm not sure how much he knew or what he was getting from his staff, but that's all down through an organization. I think you need systemic change there, and you've got to demonstrate that this is not the same MDEQ who's going to address the next crisis.
I think the specter of possible criminal liability has actually somewhat been overblown. I mean, we actually looked into this at the Free Press a couple of months ago. What was the possibility? And the criminal side of EPA regulations, it requires all kinds of stuff that you just don't, at this point, see here. But the civil liability here could be through the roof. And I suspect that is what the U.S. Attorney in Detroit is looking into with the EPA, is what are the civil actions that can be taken as a consequence.
Which is interesting because they never usually confirm any investigation that they are working on. But they said because so many people have been calling and asking, so you're thinking it's some kind of civil thing.
Beyond punishment, I think we have to be certain as a state and the people who live here that this department, this administration can respond the next time in an appropriate manner. And I think that's what makes these investigations most useful, figuring out what the heck went wrong and what preventative steps need to be put in place.
Yeah, because the testing isn't over. And I think that's what's also concerning is that no one can say for sure that the Flint Water now, the fact that they've rehooked up to the Detroit pipeline, that it's safe now to drink.
Well,
and they're waiting for some more tests to come in on
they
that.
have to test it, but you don't have the same issue with the DWSD water supply that you did. The problem here was the high levels of corrosive material in the Flint River. Pollutants that are there from years of industry along that river, and they get into the pipes and they leach the lead out of lead pipes. DWSD is not drawing from that same water source, so it doesn't have those same issues. We don't have to add chemicals to the water here to stop that from happening. So that should correct the problem. And you think of it this way. Flint had DWSD service for years and years and years before this, and lead levels in children in Flint had been going down for a long time. And also remember, it's not just water that poisons children with lead. There are lots of other environmental issues in cities like Flint where lead poisoning is an issue. But we had been seeing that go down for a long time in Flint, even as they were getting water from DWSD. So I think that is a solution. It may take some time to prove that through the...
But there's no solution for the kids who are already poisoned. I mean, that's irreversible.
You've got to go back.
And that's the big thing. So now that we're looking at this, I guess, state of emergency that has been declared, and that eases the way for potential funding to come from the state, and eventually, should they need it, from the federal government. And I think that's the looking down the road here, Nolan, is what kind of funding is going to be needed in the short term and in the long term to be able to help a community that has been damaged by this, and we will not be able to know what the fallout is for years to come.
Well, I mean, the first thing you got to do is make sure that the infrastructure is right. You don't want to be finding out 5 years from now that lead is still leaching out of those pipes. You also have to, on a broader sense, have to figure out where else we're vulnerable in Michigan to this sort of disaster because of an aging infrastructure all over the state. Our pipes, our sewer systems are in just a mess. They're old, they need repair.
Bridge Magazine had a really interesting graphic a couple of weeks ago about cities in Michigan where children's lead levels are even higher than what we've seen in Flint. And there was a lot of dots on that map. And again, that's not about the water necessarily. That's about these other things, about houses that get knocked down that have lead in them still, or other things. Lead dust is really the most lethal and problematic issue with that, and you see that in cities all over the state. So you're right that it's not just about the water in Flint. It is about aging infrastructure, getting rid of aging things, and dealing with lead abatement in a way that makes some sense.
All right, before we leave this topic, I want to throw out, I guess, also the national attention it's been getting, and specifically from now you've got Michael Moore filmmaker from Flint, who is calling for the governor to be arrested and prosecuted. You had inflammatory tweets from Cher, and I never thought I'd say that on this show. I never thought I'd mention Cher on MiWeek. But I want you guys to briefly touch upon what you think or perceive to be the national attention to this story.
Well, I mean, it's obviously not a positive story for Michigan. It's an image hit. It's an image hit to the governor, I think, in particular. You know, when you start getting sort of the lunatic fringe out there calling for hangings and executions, it just escalates the negative impact of this story on Michigan and on the Snyder administration.
Last word from you.
It's a disaster from a national standpoint. I mean, you think of the coverage that we're getting, and again, I'm really careful to keep trying to put the focus back on the victims here. I mean, you're talking about children whose lives will be altered for the rest of their lives because of this. I mean, Michael Moore, Cher, whatever. I mean, they're going to say what they want to say. They want to arrest the governor. They want to execute him. Fine, whatever. Really, the issue is how do we help these kids who have been victimized by this and do something to make their lives a little better in the future.
Yeah, kids who had no choice in the matter. All right, moving on. The country has hotly debated President Obama's gun control actions this week. Small gun sellers need now to have a license. That's what he's proposing. More funding for FBI agents to do background checks and funding for mental health treatment. Now, critics say he's abusing his power and infringing on the Second Amendment. But let's take a look at the points he's calling for, gauge their effectiveness on combating gun violence, not just mass shootings, which sometimes get the most attention, and really the scope of presidential power. That's how I want to kind of narrow this focus here tonight, because I know that we can debate gun control issues for the next hour and a half. So I'm going to give each of you the opportunity to start off and give me your sense now, as we've been able to digest this in the last 2 days, where you think the impact of his proposals are and why you think he came out. Nolan, go ahead and give me your stance first.
Well, very little impact in terms of what he's proposed. I mean, not a single thing he proposed would have prevented Newtown, the example he sort of rode this proposal in on, or any of the other mass shootings. They're very small in terms of their scope, presented in a big way. My problem is less with what he wants to do, with how he wants to do it. You know, he's going to use he's going to use executive orders to restrict constitutional rights, and I don't think, as a president, he has that authority. These are issues Congress has already weighed in on, so he's acting against the express will of the representative branch. There is no frustration clause in the Constitution. President can't stand, as he said the other day, and say, well, look, until we get a Congress who will do what I want it to do, I'm going to go ahead and basically be a dictator. I don't think the courts are going to allow this stand. As for the measures themselves,
well, which measure do you think goes beyond Congress?
Hang on, let him finish. I'm going to give you both. Then we're going to go.
That's a good question. I think the whole restriction of Second Amendment rights is not something the president can do by fiat. I think Congress took up this matter, defeated the bill, and for him to say, well, I'm going to ignore
which bill?
The background check expansion specifically, and for him to stand up there and say, I'm going to do this anyway, I don't think we've seen that happen. And this is different than immigration. This is different than energy policy, in that it is a constitutional right. I think he's got an obligation, if this is what he wants, to sell it to Congress. And if this is what the people want and Congress won't do it, our system's set up to allow the people to change their Congress.
All right, go ahead, Stephen.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I haven't heard any constitutional scholar suggest that what he's suggesting, that what he wants to do goes beyond any fundamental right that we have. And in fact, what he's talking about doing in principle is enforcing laws that are already on the books, which is totally within his purview. In fact, that's his job as the executive, to make sure that the government performs according to the way that the law says.
You don't need executive orders to force laws.
Okay,
well, but you do, because you're supposed to have background checks on guns, and so expanding them to gun shows is not a fundamental difference. By the way. But they aren't at these gun shows where the private sales take place. You know that there's all kinds of private sales of guns that are not subject to background checks. Those should be. There's not, and that's
but
not.
But the rules inside gun shows and outside gun shows are the same, and I think that's part of the problem here is all of the misinformation that's been put out sort of to gain support for these bills. There is no gun show loophole. But
there's a private sale loophole. And
there is a private sale loophole or exemption, if you will.
Well,
but you know,
here's the bigger issue. I think that what the president's doing is, you know, I think it's quite modest. You know, I wasn't.
And it's really nothing new. Again,
we've
heard a lot of these proposals before.
Yeah, we have. But it is, I think, an effort to try to use the bully pulpit somewhat to move the conversation forward and to say, look, we've got to do some things that we have so far been unwilling to do to try to address this. And what I would hope comes out of this is some effort to move even further, because Nolan's right when he says nothing that he proposed would have stopped the awful mass shootings that he was talking about.
And I think the president agrees with that. The president acknowledges that.
We got to start talking about the things that would prevent.
Well, and I think that's where people start to get a little nervous when you say that this is a step toward bypassing Congress to do all sorts of things in terms of restricting the Second Amendment. And that's what's going on here.
The most important thing he said was that the Second Amendment is a fundamental right that's in the Constitution, but it is no more important than the other rights. And when Second Amendment rights infringe on the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they're subject to regulation like every other right in the Constitution. That is absolutely.
That's not for the executive branch to determine.
It's absolutely for
we have a representative government here, and I don't think there's anything going on that rises to such a crisis that you can suspend representative government. He's basically suspending the system.
What concerns me about this announcement this week, and it was interesting that you said it, you feel that he brought this up and using it as a bully pulpit to start the conversation. My thing is where we are in an election year, in a political cycle, and where we are, the distance between two parties right now, that there's no way that there's going to be any kind of substantial conversation or substantial movement on this, and that's what I think is very disappointing.
And he knows that, and you know, my cynical view of this, that it's all about rallying the base ahead of the 2016 election. It's a very divisive issue. It's going to rally both the opponents and the supporters. I think it's all rooted in politics here. But you know, if we want to have substantial changes in gun laws and some restrictions on the Second Amendment, that needs to move through the process of government. I don't think the courts are going to let this stand.
What do you think?
I have not heard a single constitutional scholar interpret what he's saying that way. There's nothing. He's not talking about doing anything that's outside the purview of the executive. Because he's not really doing anything
what
here.
He's doing,
he's enforcing
Steve,
laws that are already on the books.
He is implementing a law that Congress already turned down.
Well,
I think that's going to be problematic in the courts. You can't say, well, Congress didn't do this, so I'm going to do it. Or in this case, Congress specifically rejected the measures that he's putting in.
That one narrow issue, maybe they turned down, but the rest of this stuff is garden variety. This is what the president does. Make sure that the government functions the way it's supposed to.
There are also problematic issues in terms of the gathering of mental health records. There are privacy concerns there. There's also problematic measures when you're saying, gosh, if you're on Social Security and you've had some mental health treatment, we're going to either give up your guns or we're not going to send you your check. I don't think that's going to fly.
So the other thing that the president possibly accomplishes here is highlighting how unreasonable one side of this conversation is. The answer always, when you talk about doing anything with regard to gun violence, is you can't do it because the Second Amendment protects my rights to do whatever I want with my gun. That is where the roadblock in this conversation has been for 25 years.
It's absolutely not true. We've layer after layer after layer that Congress has passed regulating gun ownership. Gun ownership is not a wide open prospect in America at all. But when you start getting into the area of saying we are going to withhold your Social Security check, your veterans benefit, if you've had mental health treatment and own a gun, I think you're in real problematic areas.
Or I'm not going to give you a gun. How about that?
In this case, in this proposal, you have to give up your gun.
All right. Well,
I'm
we're
okay
gonna
with that.
we're gonna see
Well,
we're gonna
you'd
see
like
how
everybody to give up all
No,
their
I don't think that.
That's
no,
not true.
that's not true.
That's
That's
not
not
true.
true. All right. Let's move on to our final topic tonight. The financial outlook for Detroit Public Schools is pretty bleak. You know that. A new report out this week from the Citizens Research Council of Michigan says the total debt is around $3.5 billion. It shows about $1.9 billion in operating liabilities, which are the unfunded pension costs and borrowing for cash flow. And there's another $1.7 billion in bonds and state loans. The district admits it will run out of cash in April. And I think when you see the numbers out like this, Nolan, it becomes, it's staggering, number one. And now you start to see where things are lining up. But the clock is ticking.
Well, I mean, they're headed to bankruptcy court. I think there's no question in my mind that they're headed to bankruptcy court. I don't see the legislature acting on this between now and April. I don't think you're going to see Detroit come to any sort of consensus itself on what it wants to do with its schools between now and then. I think you've reached now the crisis point where bankruptcy court is really the only viable option.
But the problem is that there's no relief for them available in bankruptcy court. I mean, it's not like a city who owes money to Wall Street or to creditors who are outside of government. This is all money that's owed within the system,
and most of it's the responsibility of the state.
So what does that do? What does that do to the state
giant
then?
bill to the state.
The state's got a giant bill coming anyway.
Yeah,
and if
well,
the legislature won't pay it, then a bankruptcy court is going to have to order it paid. But it's going to be paid one way or the other by Michigan taxpayers.
It will be paid by Michigan taxpayers.
I think
right.
if you listen to what's being said in Lansing, it looks as if they're headed straight toward bankruptcy court.
I don't think they'll get to bankruptcy court. I mean, I think
how will they avoid it?
I think a federal district court judge can present a bill to the state to say, look, this government entity can't pay it. You are the ultimate financial authority. It's your bill. You gotta make good on it.
I think they're looking at Chapter 9 before that.
But that's for reorganization.
And you have.
What would you do? What are you going to reorganize?
And any number of creditors can throw them into bankruptcy at this point.
Right.
I'm not sure.
Okay, so what does that do then? You know, what does that do to the state? And if you do go into bankruptcy, what does that then do to, 36,000, 40,000 kids who are in the district?
I'm starting to wonder whether we're at the same point that we were in 1993, when Kalkaska schools were allowed to essentially run out of money before the school year ended, and that was the sort of, a lot of people would say it was a manufactured crisis because the legislature and the governor
We had a school district recently that happened in Buena Vista.
Right, in order to get people to, but in 93 and 94 what that did was move the ball in terms of Proposal A and the refinancing of schools so that would not happen any longer. Maybe we're at the same point where something like Detroit the Detroit schools becoming insolvent moves the legislature to deal with the problem here and elsewhere. I mean, I keep saying over and over that this is not just a Detroit problem. It's biggest in Detroit and it's worst in Detroit, but you can go to school districts all over Michigan and find the same issues. We've got to start talking about how we deal with school finance, with legacy costs, and all those things in that context.
Same issues on a smaller scale, but
I mean, what can they do? I mean, what are the options?
I think you need another Prop A type solution. You've got to really change the fundamental basis for funding schools. It's got to be more reliable and steady and
But what
and
source
growth.
would be that?
I'm not sure.
We've
I think you look
tried
at other
property
states.
taxes, that didn't
We've tried
work.
Sales tax.
I mean, I don't know what source would solve this problem. I mean, they're buried under legacy costs. They've got $32 billion in pension debt upcoming that's statewide. I don't know where that money is.
And again, you have instability in the school system because you have teachers who are not happy about this, and so you're getting sick-outs, and you're getting schools that are shut down.
Which isn't helpful.
Which is not helpful. But again, we sat here, it was a year ago in January that we sat here saying, oh, we're going to get a report out from the Coalition for Detroit Schools and talking about what possible solutions that could be. And this is going to come together by the spring. It was supposed to be last spring. And so now we're at this point. So if I'm a parent in the Detroit Schools District and I see that my district's going to run out of money, money and the amount of staggering debt. I mean, how do you say as a parent, oh, I'm for the long haul. I'm going to send my kids back to school there.
You're not, and that's why half of them don't send their children. They're half the school-age children in Detroit go to non-public school or non-traditional public schools. They're in charters, they're in private schools, they're in suburban school districts.
All right, last word on this, Stephen,
Yeah,
before we wrap up.
I think we are at a stage where the legislature and the government are going to have to act, and I think they're going to act in a big way. I'm worried about that happening in an election year. They shouldn't have put it off this far, but I don't think they're going to have a choice. If the school district runs out of money, can't pay its bills, then you do have an actual crisis with a huge bill.
Yeah.
So.
All right. Well, we're going to have to leave it there tonight. Hey, the auto show is coming up, the press preview, all the people from out of town coming in
Sunday
next
night,
week.
right.
Yeah. And so we'll be talking about that a little bit next week. All right.
Lots of parties next week.
There you go. Lots of parties next week. It's good to see you guys. That's going to do it for MiWeek this week. Check out MiWeek.org for the shows that you might have missed around the holidays. We have extensive interviews with Governor Snyder and Mayor Mike Duggan. You'll want to check those out. Plus, we're on Facebook and we're on Twitter throughout the week and on MiWeek, so find us there. For all of us at Detroit Public TV, I'm Christy McDonald. Have a great night. We will see you next week. Take care.
Did you know? During World War II, the Wolverine Shoe and Tanning Company, currently known as Wolverine Worldwide, worked for the U.S. Navy developing pigskin gloves. After the war, they began producing pigskin suede and created suede casual shoes known as Hush Puppies. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out, as small companies with big ideas. We are the business leaders for Michigan.
Funding is also provided by Delta,